something far more dangerous than a political scandal just unfolded in Washington. Not a policy failure, not an election fight, but a stress test of the American system itself. I want you to pause for a moment and listen carefully, because what happened was not about Donald Trump losing his temper on social media. It was about what happens when a president treats constitutional oversight as personal betrayal and responds with threats instead of answers. This is how democracies don't collapse loudly. They erode quietly when lawmakers begin to fear asking questions, when loyalty replaces law, and when intimidation becomes governance. If members of Congress can't do their jobs without risking their safety, then the system meant to protect you is already in trouble. Stay with me, because once you see the pattern behind this moment, you'll understand why even Trump's own party is panicking and why this story is bigger than Trump himself. And to grasp that, we need to start with what should have been the most boring event in Washington. What makes this moment so alarming is not the outburst itself. American politics has seen anger before. What makes it different is where the anger landed and why. This didn't start with an investigation. It didn't begin with impeachment or opposition attacks. It began inside Trump's own party during a routine budget hearing, the kind that happens every year, the kind no one outside Washington usually notices. Republican lawmakers asked basic questions about spending, numbers, trade-offs, impact on their districts. That is not rebellion. That is not sabotage. That is Congress doing exactly what the Constitution demands. But here's the problem. In a system built on checks and balances, oversight is supposed to be normal. In Trump's political universe, oversight is treated as treason. That distinction matters. Because when a president cannot tolerate even mild internal scrutiny, the issue is no longer policy. It's power. And power, once personalized, doesn't stop escalating on its own. To understand why this single hearing triggered such an explosive reaction, we need to step back and examine the system Trump has been operating inside. To see why this reaction was almost inevitable, you have to understand the political ecosystem that has been quietly built over the past decade. Trump did not rise inside a traditional party structure. He replaced it. Over time, Republican politics shifted from ideology to identity, from policy debates to loyalty tests. Support was no longer measured by votes or legislation, but by obedience. Questioning became indistinguishable from betrayal. This didn't happen overnight. Each time Trump attacked a critic and faced no real consequences, the boundary moved. Each time lawmakers stayed silent to protect their careers, the system adapted around the behavior instead of restraining it. Eventually, the incentives flipped. The safest move became compliance. The most dangerous act became honesty. In that kind of environment, a budget hearing is no longer procedural, it's a threat. A simple question about numbers becomes a challenge to authority. And when authority is personal, not institutional, challenges are answered emotionally, not rationally. This is the historical context most people miss. The meltdown wasn't random, it was structural. And once you understand that structure, the next phase was unavoidable. Then the pressure finally found its trigger. A routine budget hearing. No shouting, no accusations, just a Republican lawmaker asking how proposed cuts would affect the people he represents. That was it. One question, one moment of oversight. And within minutes, the system snapped. Trump didn't respond with clarification or negotiation. He responded with rage, post after post, name after name. The language escalated quickly, from political criticism to personal condemnation, from disagreement to accusations of betrayal. This was the first visible crack. Because when a president publicly attacks his own allies for asking questions, something important changes. The message becomes unmistakable. Loyalty matters more than truth. If you're watching this and thinking, this is just rhetoric, pause. Because rhetoric shapes behavior. Signals become incentives, and incentives reshape institutions. This wasn't just an emotional reaction, it was a warning shot to every lawmaker watching in real time. Remember this moment, share it, talk about it, because it explains everything that followed. And once that line was crossed publicly, the consequences moved fast and far beyond social media. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. Trump's power does not operate primarily through laws or institutions. It operates through signaling. A post is not just a post, it's an instruction, a declaration of who is protected and who is exposed. When Trump labels a lawmaker a traitor, he's not debating policy. He's redefining legitimacy. He's telling millions of followers who belongs inside the moral community and who doesn't. In that system, consequences don't come from courts or Congress. They come from the crowd. This is the hidden machinery. Personal loyalty replaces constitutional duty. Fear replaces deliberation, and ambiguity is weaponized. The language never has to explicitly call for violence. It only has to suggest that real patriots know what to do. Once that signal is sent, responsibility becomes diffuse. Trump didn't make anyone act, supporters claim. Supporters chose to act, Trump claims. And in that gap, intimidation thrives without accountability. This is why the situation is so dangerous. Not because of one outburst, but because the system rewards escalation and punishes restraint. And when that machinery spins up, the next phase is no longer theoretical. It becomes real, personal, and immediate. The moment the language went public, the consequences followed almost instantly. Phone numbers were shared, names were repeated, targets were clearly marked, and within hours, congressional offices were flooded not with debate, but with threats. Staffers answered calls promising violence. Offices reported language no democracy should ever normalize. At that point, the crisis crossed a threshold. This was no longer about speech. It was about safety. Capitol Police had to intervene. Security was increased. Lawmakers began asking a question that should never have to be asked in a functioning republic. Is it safe to do my job? That's the second rupture. Because once fear enters the legislative process, oversight collapses from the inside. Not through force, but through silence. People stop asking questions. Hearings become performances. Accountability evaporates. And here's the most unsettling part. This effect doesn't require universal participation. It only takes a few high-profile examples to discipline everyone else. Intimidation doesn't need to reach all lawmakers, just enough to make the risk visible. This is the point where even Trump's allies understood something had gone very wrong. Because the damage was no longer political. It was institutional. And now, the fallout wasn't abstract anymore. It landed directly on the people this system is supposed to represent. And this is where it stops being abstract and starts affecting you. Because when lawmakers are afraid, they don't stop working. They stop protecting, they stop pushing. They stop asking the questions that are supposed to defend your interests when powerful people would rather not be questioned. You don't see the hearings that never happen. You don't hear the questions that go unasked. You only feel the results later when policies pass without scrutiny, when money is allocated without explanation, when accountability quietly disappears. If a representative risks death threats for asking about budget cuts in their district, imagine what happens to issues that are even more controversial. Healthcare, labor rights, corporate power, national security. Fear doesn't announce itself, it normalizes itself. And here's the hardest truth. Intimidation works best when ordinary people look away, when it feels distant, when it feels like just politics. It isn't. This is about whether the system meant to serve you still has the courage to speak on your behalf. If that matters to you, if you believe democracy only works when questioning power is safe, then this moment deserves your attention. Because what's happening next doesn't stop at America's borders. When American institutions weaken, the effects don't stay contained. They ripple outward. Allies watch closely how the United States handles internal pressure. Not speeches, but behavior. When a president intimidates legislators and faces no immediate restraint, it sends a signal far beyond Washington. Democratic norms are negotiable. Authoritarian leaders understand this instantly. They don't need propaganda, they need precedent. If the world's most powerful democracy tolerates threats against its own lawmakers, others feel licensed to go further against journalists, judges, opposition parties. Markets notice too. Political instability doesn't have to mean tanks in the streets. It can mean unpredictability at the top. Investors price in risk. Diplomatic commitments become conditional. Long-term planning gives way to short-term caution. And then there's the credibility problem. How does the United States advocate for rule of law abroad when its own leaders undermine it at home? How do alliances built on shared democratic values hold when those values appear fragile? This is why moments like this matter globally, not because the U.S. is perfect, but because its failures carry outsized consequences. The real danger isn't collapse, it's normalization. And once that becomes the baseline, the future stops being theoretical. It becomes a choice with consequences. From here, the system moves toward one of three paths. None of them are abstract. All of them are already taking shape. The first path is resistance. Institutions hold. Lawmakers across parties draw a clear line between criticism and intimidation. Oversight continues, even under pressure. Courts, Congress, and civil society reinforce the idea that no individual is above constitutional boundaries. This path is difficult, costly, and politically dangerous for those who choose it. But it preserves the system by proving that fear does not rule it. The second path is drift. Nothing formally breaks, but nothing is repaired either. Threats are condemned quietly, then forgotten. Oversight becomes selective. Lawmakers learn which questions are safe. The system still functions, but in a diminished form, hollowed out, cautious, reactive. Democracy survives, but weakened, less capable of correcting itself. The third path is submission. Intimidation works, silence spreads, power consolidates around personal loyalty, oversight becomes symbolic. At that point, elections still happen, laws still exist, but real accountability is gone. The system no longer checks power, it serves it. Every democracy faces moments like this. What determines the outcome is not the outburst, but the response. And that brings us to the final question. This moment forces all of us to confront. So this isn't about Donald Trump having a bad day. It's about what happens when power reacts to accountability with intimidation and whether the system pushes back or steps aside. Every constitutional system depends on one fragile assumption, that asking questions is safe. The moment lawmakers calculate personal risk before fulfilling their duty, democracy doesn't fail all at once. It bends, quietly, incrementally, until one day, silence feels normal. History shows this pattern again and again. Institutions don't collapse because people hate democracy. They collapse because fear becomes more efficient than law. What you're watching now is a test, not of Trump, but of everyone around him, of lawmakers deciding whether their oath matters more than their careers, of parties choosing between short-term power and long-term legitimacy, of citizens deciding whether this still deserves their attention. Because systems don't protect themselves. People do. If you want to understand where this goes next, who resists, who retreats, and what happens when intimidation either fails or succeeds, stay with this story. Share it, question it, follow what comes next. This moment will not be remembered for the posts. It will be remembered for the response. And that response is still being written